Thank you very much, Naveen. A good morning to all of you, and very much appreciate the invitation to speak today. And my talk is going to be about land use dynamics at and interactions at the urban-rural gradient to possibly make a contribution in bringing the urban discussion in the big land discussions. In my presentation, I'll be talking about a couple of things, one of which is to try and synthesize the evolution of cities like Kampala. I'll use Kampala, where I work most of the time, as the example, and also mention or make sure that we think about the scale at which you can work on land use science issues, the multiple scales at which you can work on land use issues, and Kampala is one good test field. But there are many other cities in the Global South that we can refer to. I'll also talk about what is happening within the ecological zones where urban systems are growing and expanding, and how we can rethink the ecologies within the cities, moving from ecology and perhaps for, as we were reminded yesterday. And then also use some case study to point towards how we can integrate nature with urban systems in different ways and at multiple scales while we maintain productivity and also deal with the global challenges of climate change, but also reducing disaster risk. I throw in this slide and a couple of them to remind ourselves about the IPCC 1.5 degree report, which talks about very significant changes needed, transformative in big four systems: energy, land use, ecosystems, urban infrastructure, and industry. And I just want to highlight that cities or urban systems are likely to be very important in this transition and transformation globally, even when there's disputed statistics about how much surface land is occupied by cities. Yesterday, I was exposed to a study that put it at 1.4. Other literature puts it at about 5% of the global land. But even if we think about it as 2 or 5%, I think what happens in cities is going to be important. And picking a little bit from the earlier presentation, if the global deal for nature is going to utilize innovative areas like agriculture, what happens in cities that drives the demand for food and other resources actually will enable the innovation around agriculture and several other initiatives or sectors. So there's need for accelerated and deep decarbonization. As pointed out in the IPCC 1.5 degree report, the mention of healthy consumptive lifestyles and better management of land systems is very critical in some of the pathways that were identified by the science from IPCC. So what is important is to think about this term from moving from, for example, urban land management to urban land use management. And contemporary urban land management is about making the benefit out of the functional activities on that land, depending on how economically feasible they are. But I think it's a point where we are now is to think about how we can actually take some of the land, even within urban systems, off the market in order to embrace nature, but also deal with climate change and other issues. Just as a reminder to our discussions about that. So it matters then that city regions are part of the discussion in respect to better land use management. And that is because they are very intense resource users as well as consumptive territories. And when it comes to infrastructure, big infrastructure, they've also been in some ways culprits of actually degrading land and ecological systems within areas where they lie. And it's important to actually break the cycles of path dependencies in many of these city areas or city regions. There are also frontiers of very complex lifestyles, and therefore we need to start thinking about behavior change and how to stimulate the transformation of behavior within cities and health areas to try and reduce the resource consumption and lifestyles that are impacting on resource use globally. They're very interestingly a cultural mix, and yesterday in the plenary I think there was a very key point highlighted about the importance of land and culture, and I think the last question about indigenous peoples, which I also agree with, is very important, because evidence coming out of some of these very local context-specific studies in respect to indigenous communities managing their resources, like in Uganda and other places, is positive. And I think it's important to think about the science of how indigenous knowledge can be utilized to better manage land areas. So despite the problems that cities present, I want to think of cities as frontiers of opportunity for transformation. And in the context of Africa, where the second wave of urbanization is arguably being presented in literature as happening, I think of African cities as test beds, as pilots or experiments where we can change the ways in which cities are developed at multiple scales, from plot level to mesoscale and city regional scale. And that would include many things, including embracing nature, enabling and enhancing productivity, but also enhancing ecosystem services within those city regions. So how cities, in my opinion, have grown in the Global South. There are lots of arguments about Global South urbanism. Those notwithstanding, it's important to note, just like other cities, that technology, economy, and transformation or advanced systems have been the immediate drivers of urbanization and urban development in the cities, and the underlying driver is mainly the demographic shift. And as I mentioned earlier, and Africa is arguably leading the second wave of urbanization. But these cities in the Global South also exemplify differences in terms of not only process, but the imprint that is left. There are many descriptions that have been used previously, 1980s, 1990s, pseudo-urbanization, that is urbanization happening without alignment to economic growth, urbanization by implosion, and yesterday we had a very interesting session about the urban-rural gradient interactions and how small village hamlets actually transform into town centers and municipalities, and perhaps potentially, by prediction, cities. So that imploding nature of urbanization within city regions is also a very important concept to think about and was used to describe. But one of the things that I want to put to table is the informal cities, or cities that have largely evolved and developed as informal, in the sense that the contemporary urban planning procedures and processes are actually not followed in much of the development of cities in the Global South. And the city where I come from, and the one that I'm going to talk a little bit about, is one example there, because it presents, and just like other cities, quite unique and different spatial imprints in terms of development. So this is what I think of in terms of the imposing characteristic of informality in cities. So this is somewhere in central Uganda, and this can be anywhere in Europe, it can be anywhere in America, and this is considered to be formal, and that is informal. So the character of those cities is something to think about, not only in terms of making it more livable and more eco-friendly, but also thinking about the opportunities that lie within these informal cities that could be tinkered or harnessed for transformation. So in terms of the expansion and intensification, and this is at the point where I start zooming into the case study that I am currently studying with a team of others in our lab. The history and the economics is very important in this particular city development, because of strategic location in history, in terms of colonial production and other things, in terms of a hub for connecting different regions and transportation. And because it developed strategically, it also developed within an area that is highly productive for agriculture, and that is a big problem, not only in Kampala, but also other cities where more urban growth and expansion is actually leading to agricultural loss, but also biodiversity loss, and the competition that have been triggered by this urban sprawl varied. So urban and agriculture in terms of food competition is intense, but also think about urban development and forestry for cities and air, which are developing close to terrestrial ecosystems. And then the competition between agriculture and forestry, and also in some areas biofuels and forestry. So this work was very much in the book that was edited by Karen and Ned. on rethinking global land use in an era of urbanization, which is, I think, is a very important message in terms of looking at the competition. So even when urban areas, especially or in terms of area globally, occupying a very small piece proportion, it's very important to think about what we can do in this small portion to change the way cities develop. So this is an example of the city region of Kampala and how it has developed over time. And it's very clearly sprawling, a city, and it's not the only one. There are many cities that are sprawling. Gentrification of peri-urban zones and rural areas within its immediate hinterland is also an important process that is going on, producing clusters of high-dense neighborhoods or small towns or satellite cities. And the issue of fragmentation of the ecosystem within the city region is very critical as a result, driven by real estate development and infrastructure development. And in the case of Kampala, this is something that is happening. But urban and peri-urban agriculture remains very much in practice, and that is something that we may have to think about in terms of tinkering these systems. The ecosystem services are rather reducing, as I will show there, and biodiversity loss and increases along the urban gradient from the preliminary studies that we have conducted or results that we have that have emerged out of our study. So it's important to think about how the gradient could be managed better. So from moving from urban land management to urban land use management is something that is important. So again, this is the city, and part of the work that we've done is to take an inventory of the urban natural assets within the city region on the right. And you can see that the highly urbanized area has more, this is not very clear, but urban development surfaces, and the immediate rural hinterland still has some natural patches that are existing. And the change here, the change detection here has a forestry loss is very important. And wetlands and swamps are also being lost. So the blue is the 2010 and the red is 2014. So a reduction in natural assets within the city region is already clear there, and it can be demonstrated with this. We did a kind of hotspot analysis for the urban natural assets within the city region, and the key points that come out of the interactions we had with different people, as well as the literature, is settlement and agriculture. It pops up many times in the word cloud from the literature, but this map here shows how the city region is changed and this threat to natural assets within the city region. So you can see that there are only a few areas where the threat to natural assets are very, very, very limited, and that is just around the lake front of Kampala. But at a much more fine-grained scale in terms of plot development and highways and boulevards, there's something that has happened before that could actually be looked at as potentially useful in better land use management of urban systems. This is one of the highway in the colonial planned part of Kampala with different trees lined on the boulevard. Now, the problem of the species introduced in the city notwithstanding, something that might be looked at is looking at how native cities can actually be brought back within the city region. And this can happen in Kampala, but could also happen elsewhere. So the issue of ecosystem and landscape fragmentation is important, and the challenge goes beyond administrative zones. By administration, the city itself, jurisdiction is the inner circle, but in terms of function and the different activities going on, including transportation systems, the interactions along the city center and the rural areas is very intense. So it goes beyond the administrative boundaries, and that is something that needs to be considered in this debate. We did an analysis of the trade-offs and synergies of different ways at plot level to measure scale that you can enhance ecosystem services coming from the inventory of the urban natural assets. And one thing that I have to highlight is that from the private perspective, there's very low consideration about environment and social responsibility, but it's to do with returns. And this is the point where we start thinking, okay, is it possible to take some of the land within the city regions off the land market so that the intrinsic valuation of natural assets is actually taken into account, and we enhance the ecosystem services there. In terms of carbon management, it is low, but it can be high if you think about different ways within which you can tinker the urban ecosystems. So in terms of rethinking, the urban ecology is given that trend in terms of degradation. There are many things that we can think about. The current urban development trajectory is very much driven by the modernist thinking about the city, concrete and steel, impervious services and buildings. And in some cases, it's a show of technological advancement. And you can give various examples. If I can zoom out of Kampala, the new capital east of Cairo, the new capital in Dhaka, the eco-Atlantic city off the coast of Lagos. All those are examples of how the dominant thinking is like. And there's very less consideration of nature, except where nature is considered to be for pleasure, for spiritual connections, as well as aesthetics. And I found this in many other places. But peri-urban zones continue to play a key role in provisioning or contributing to people's welfare in terms of resources that flow along the urban-rural gradient. But there is also flows back to rural areas. And this is less talked about, but there's evidence in the case of Kampala of some exploitation. We haven't quantified this yet. What I think of as exploitation of pollution, but in the more positive sense, there's also financial flows back to rural regions. And as I end my talk, I start concluding my talk, I just want to flag 3 quotes which I think are very useful. But look at the time. From 1970 and 2018, there has been a call for a new science, the new urban science, that actually embraces how people connect. And if you go into the work of Doxiadis in terms of the aesthetics theory, it talks about how people strategically locate settlements on the basis of how they would connect with nature, but also connect with them and maximize that connection with nature and connection with the other human systems. And then Marina also talks about a new urban science, and Bill, Soleki, and Karen also talked about a new urbanization science, which is a kind of calling, and most recently the Nature Sustainability panel on the science and the future of cities also actually talks about global urban science that reaches out across disciplines, interdisciplinary, and towards impact and being accountable to shaping cities that are livable, but cities that are also less resource intense users. So is this the science that we might be thinking about? And this could, for many of us, present some kind of linearity, but that is not the question. The issue or the question is, how do we find some workable thresholds or equilibria between the blue and gray human culture as well as gray parts of the systems within urban areas, and what would that balance be? And it's very important to recognize that this is very much local context specific, but it matters a lot to work at a particular scale in order to find the equilibria or the thresholds needed to balance between these different aspects. So a couple of things to think about in terms of density, land use, and dispensation, as well as network. The medium density is something to look at. This is very much what's related to wastewater and water resource use, but land use mixes is also an important thing to think about within this new approach of multiple objective of urban planning, and then looking at clusters and shortening the paths of movement along the network. All these are possibilities, and this is why I say that the areas that are urbanizing in the contemporary could be very good experimentation areas for new ways of doing things. And my 2 last slides actually point to a case where which we worked on in Kampala, where we designed a neighborhood that we call the edible landscape, that actually tries to balance all the different elements as shown in the previous figure in terms of water resource use and wetland use, providing residences, but also recycling and reusing of reusable organic and non-organic materials. And is it possible to therefore transcend the feeling of biophilia within cities and look at how we weave urban landscapes to integrate nature? And at a much more scale for urban designers from yesterday's session, this is one of the possibilities that could be done, and cumulatively that could also have an impact in terms of reducing resource use within city regions as well as addressing climate change and disaster risk. And I thank you very much for your attention.